Senators get ready for an impeachment trial. Some are reportedly wary of Giuliani's escapades. The Daily Beast reports senators on Capitol Hill are actively avoiding meeting with Giuliani. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham said, quote, "My advice to Giuliani would be to share what he got from Ukraine with the intelligence community to make sure it's not Russian propaganda. I'm very suspicious of what the Russians are up to all over the world." For more, I'm joined by Aaron Benko, national security reporter for the Daily Beast, and Larry Pfeiffer, former chief of staff at the CIA. And Larry, first to you. From this reporting, we now know, we didn't know before, that Ukraine was no outlier. You got Rudy Giuliani running shadow foreign policy in at least Venezuela as well. And this was in September 2018. This is well before he was trying to sideline Marie Yovanovitch in the spring of 2019, the spring of this past year. So what stands out to you as you read all of this and put it all together?
Yeah. Who knew Ukraine was actually Act 2 of this play and not Act 1? What stands out? What stands out is it's many of the same players. It's many of the same kinds of activity. It's the same possible commingling of national security work with his own personal economic interests. You've got Lev Parnas involved. If with all of those variables the same, one can only imagine that the other variable that we're not certain of yet is probably true as well, and that is that this was activity that Donald Trump himself was personally involved in. The other thing that really stands out to me, we've had shadow diplomacy, for 2+ centuries of American history, but when it happens, it's done in coordination with the national security infrastructure of our country. The National Security Advisor is involved and supportive. The intelligence community is usually briefing the individual so that they can go into these discussions in an informed manner. But clearly, if these articles to be believed, and as we saw with Ukraine, the national security infrastructure is actually opposed to what he's doing. That, I think, is what really makes this one different.
Yeah, you touched on something I want to draw you out on, and that's the fact that Giuliani so often blends his personal business interests with the work he's doing for President Trump. And during the impeachment hearings, one of the things that we heard Fiona Hill say was that, to her mind, it was a national security nightmare to have people like Rudy Giuliani and Gordon Sondland running around Eastern Europe, basically selling access to President Trump to the highest bidder. What are the unintended consequences of something like that?
Well, there's a significant counterintelligence risk. If these are individuals that are operating outside of the normal national security process, they are not as well informed. If our American journalists are learning about the activities, well, I guarantee you the foreign intelligence services of Europe, including the Russians and some of the Eastern European countries, they're even more aware of it. And as they become aware of it, they can identify vulnerabilities, and these individuals can then be played, or they can perhaps be compromised. Yeah. So a great counterintelligence risk.
Hey, Aaron Benko, I'm old enough to remember, because it was just, 2 months ago, where Lindsey Graham said he wanted Rudy Giuliani to come testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is the committee that Graham leads in the Senate, in part because Lindsey Graham wanted to have some counter-programming to put up against the Democrats, the House Democrats' impeachment push. Now you've got Lindsey Graham saying that he's concerned about this information that Rudy Giuliani dug up and brought back.
Yeah, that's right. I was, had a phone call with Senator Graham, and that was not what I was expecting to hear on the other end of the line. It's a new development. And, as we dug around after speaking to Senator Graham, that this is a sentiment felt by other Republican lawmakers, especially in the Senate, as well, and Democrats who we spoke to as well, that, the characters that Giuliani is meeting with in Ukraine, people like Andrei Derkach, Alexander Dubinsky, two Ukrainian parliamentarians who are sort of more closely aligned with the Russian bloc of the Ukrainian parliament, who are known for peddling Russian conspiracy theories on their social media threads, holding press conferences. And we know from Giuliani's trip to Kyiv that he met with those individuals and then worked with them on this new documentary that he's put out. And that's what's really concerning senators before the impeachment trial. Like, hey, listen, we need to figure out whether or not the information that we might potentially get briefed on is Russian propaganda.
Yeah, well, for his part, President Trump has been supportive of Giuliani's most recent trip to Ukraine, telling reporters earlier this month his lawyer had found what he called good information. Take a look at this.
Well, I just know he came back from someplace and he's going to make a report, I think, to the Attorney General and to Congress. He says he has a lot of good information. He has not told me what he's found, but I think he wants to go before Congress and say, and also to the Attorney General and the Department of Justice, I hear he's found plenty.
And just 2 weeks ago, just days before the House voted to pass articles of impeachment, President Trump was asked how much Giuliani had shared with him about his visit to Ukraine.
No, not too much, but he's a very great crime fighter. He was the best mayor in the history of the city of New York. He's a great person who loves our country, and he does this out of love. Believe me, he does it out of love. He sees what goes on. He sees what's happening. He sees all of the hoax that happens when they talk about impeachment hoax or the Russian collusion delusion.
So, Aaron, do we know what Giuliani has told Trump? Is that a knowable thing? Do we know what he has briefed him on as it relates to whatever he was trying to unearth in Ukraine?
We've certainly asked both Mr. Giuliani, officials at the White House, and Giuliani's lawyer. We have not gotten a straight answer about exactly what President Trump and Giuliani have spoken about, but we do know that they spoke about the Ukraine trip, if not briefly, and at length for at least an hour, is what we've heard. We've also heard that Giuliani has brought back a lot of materials from Ukraine to brief President Trump, documents and other kinds of materials that he's brought back after meeting with these two individuals in Parliament who I mentioned earlier. Now, the Daily Beast previously obtained a 50-page document from one of those Ukrainian parliamentarians. And that specific dossier has been circulated among top Trump administration officials in the past several months. And what it lays out are allegations saying that Ukraine actually interfered in the 2016 election and that it wasn't Russia. And that is a well-debunked conspiracy theory that has been propagated for at least a year. And we know this kind of material has made its way into Giuliani's hands and has been briefed, has been sort of read out to people inside the White House, including President Trump.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.